Just by watching this video, your curiosity is inviting the demonic to visit you personally. So hopefully you don't end up in a future installment of the most terrifying exorcisms ever recorded. 2021, Italy. St. Mary of Mount Berico Sanctuary is a stunning church with a centuries-old history. In the 15th century, it was reportedly the location of two miraculous appearances of the Virgin Mary. However, in 2021, this tranquil church was shaken by a surge of demonic activity. The event would require the coordination of dozens of priests and the consultation with others over the internet over how to subdue this evil spirit responsible. Italian authorities have withheld the victim's name so as to protect her privacy, and what we know comes from her parents and the priests who saw her through a grueling 9-hour exorcism. It all began on a Sunday during confession. According to her parents, the victim had already been struggling with demonic influences and had previously seen an exorcist in Verona. Her father feared that she was suffering from psychological problems, but her mother was convinced the affliction was spiritual in nature. Agreeing to at least take their daughters to a priest first, the father acquiesced, and the victim sat through Mass before taking confession. Suddenly, the woman began to grow increasingly agitated, her body convulsing. She also began to hurl insults at the priests present, but interestingly, she was hurling some of these insults and profanities in Latin. The assembled worshippers stared in awe as the young woman's body convulsed, and she spat out a steady stream of obscenities and blasphemies. Quickly realizing how dire the situation was, the priests began to usher people out of the church, barring the doors behind them to prevent any innocent bystanders from getting caught up in the spiritual assault. Word spread quickly, and several police officers along with an ambulance were quick to arrive on scene. But inside the church, the battle for the victim's soul was in full swing. The church's official exorcist, Father Giuseppe Bernardi, was called to the scene and soon began the ancient ritual to cast out the evil spirits. The father called out repeatedly for Satan himself to leave the woman's body, invoking the authority of Jesus Christ himself, and yet he was making no progress. The woman continued to pull violently at her restraints and hurled even more profanities in perfect Latin. Calling for reinforcements, Father Bernardi had 3 friars join him, yet even their combined prayers failed to subdue the evil. Via the internet and cell phone, church officials reached out to other exorcists in other dioceses, and a giant remote prayer ring was formed, all focusing on expelling the demonic forces inside the afflicted woman. Whatever had a grip on her wasn't letting go without a fight first, and she suddenly lunged at one of the priests, injuring him before being restrained once more. Outside the ancient church, the faithful had gathered to pray for the girl. As the fight dragged on, she began to fall into periods of quiet only to explode in violence and profanities once more. It would take a grueling 9-hour ritual to at last calm the evil inside of her, leaving the girl free of whatever had taken hold of her. Or at least it seemed that way, as she fell into a deep sleep. Father Bernardi warned that removing a demon as stubborn as this one, or a whole host of them, could take multiple exorcisms. This newfound calm and peace was no indication of the terrible ordeal truly being over, but it was for now. Latoya Ammons. Skeptics witnessing a young girl walking backward up a wall. Over 800 pages of official records. The exorcisms of Latoya Ammons and her family are one of the most terrifying cases of exorcism ever to be officially documented. In November 2011, Latoya Ammons and her family moved into a new home in Indianapolis. Not long after the family, including 3 young children, moved in, they had their first encounter with the supernatural. Novembers in Indianapolis can be chilly, with temperature hovering right around or just above freezing. This will kill most flies, who survive by burying their next generation several inches underground. However, some flies can survive by weathering the winter indoors. But this does not explain what the Ammons family witnessed shortly after moving in. The buzzing of flies would get their family's attention one day, and to their horror they discovered the entire porch was covered in large black flies. This was nearly impossible as the temperatures were extremely low, and the entire porch was screened in to keep the insects out. Believing it to be an isolated incident though, the family used a variety of pesticides to kill the flies, ending the infestation. Only it didn't end. Time and again, the flies returned, swarming the porch each time they did. For anyone with prior knowledge of exorcisms and demons, this would have been a warning sign. Flies have long been connected with the presence of evil, with one particular demon known as the Lord of Flies, Beelzebub or Beelzebub. Formerly worshipped by some ancient cultures and in Christian demonology, is considered one of the 7 princes of hell, though often the name is used as another name for Satan. Beelzebub makes an appearance in ancient Hebrew scriptures, notably in the 2nd book of Kings, chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Here, King Ahaziah of the northern kingdom of Israel sends messengers to consult Beelzebub regarding his recovery from a severe fall. However, Ahaziah's decision to seek the aid of demons seals his fate, as God decrees that he will succumb to his injuries for turning to demons instead of relying on divine intervention. In the New Testament, Jesus faces accusations of exorcising demons through the authority of Beelzebub. Yet Jesus refutes the notion, highlighting the absurdity of a house divided against itself being able to stand. The presence of the flies seemingly supernaturally replenishing their numbers and always attracted to the same spot, despite the harsh weather, indicated the presence of something far more evil. The demonic entity would make itself known in other ways, seemingly gaining power the more terrified it made the family. At night, shortly after midnight, the family would sometimes hear the distinct sound of footsteps rising up from the depths of the basement to the kitchen door. The heavy steps were clearly audible to everyone in the house and would stop right at the door to the kitchen. Then, a moment later, the family would hear the chilling sound of the door swinging open by itself. Initially fearful of an intruder, LaToya would hurry to check on the source of the noise, only to discover the door open and nobody there. Eventually, she stopped checking, accepting that whatever she was hearing was nothing human. In a desperate attempt to make the phenomenon end, she began to lock the kitchen door, though this did nothing to stop the entity from noisily stomping up the basement stairs all the way up to the locked door. In one of those incidents, LaToya's mother, Rose Campbell, was visiting and asleep in the living room. She was awoken by heavy footsteps, only to realize that a shadowy figure was standing in the living room. The figure began to move back and forth across the living room, stomping loudly as it did. Once the lights were turned on, though, the figure disappeared, leaving behind large wet boot prints on the carpet. Things quickly escalated from here, prompting a police and child protective services investigation that would leave officials from both convinced the phenomenon was real. The terrifying turn took place one night at 2 a.m. The adults were sleeping, with a friend invited over as the group mourned the recent death of a loved one. Suddenly, they were awoken by the sounds of screaming. LaToya rushed to the children's room and began to shout for her mother, prompting Rose to rush to their aid. As she ran into the room and stared in awe at her granddaughter unconscious and levitating above her bed. Her granddaughter's friend was also staying in the same room and had been the one to begin screaming originally. Now the three rushed to surround the levitating girl as the group began to pray aloud. The child would eventually float harmlessly back down to their bed, but LaToya and Rose's friends left the home and refused to ever return again. That was when Rose told her daughter they needed help. Whatever was in the house was clearly evil and hell-bent on tormenting the family. As their fear of it increased, the entity seemed to grow ever bolder, causing more and more outrageous displays that created more fear in a self-reinforcing cycle of terror. However, as the two reached out to local churches, they soon discovered that few Christian leaders were actually willing to help them. In all likelihood, they feared being caught up in something that a few modern American Baptists really believed in, as it was well established in Baptist ideology that only non-Christians can be possessed, and evangelicals lack any formal rite of exorcism. However, one church was able to help the family. Coming to visit for themselves, the church staff informed Rose and LaToya that it was well known that the home that they had moved into was haunted. They recommended that the home be cleansed with a deep cleansing of bleach and ammonia, which would have been really effective if the family had been haunted by black mold and not demons. They were then told to use olive oil to draw crosses on every door and window, as well as to wash the children's hands and feet in oil and smear it on their foreheads in the shape of a cross. But oil has no power in and of itself, and the demonic activity continued, albeit in a much cleaner home. In their desperation, Rose and LaToya reached out to clairvoyants, who claimed that the home was under spiritual siege by a horde of demons. They recommended the family move immediately, but with the family earning so little income, moving was simply not an option. One of the clairvoyants offered to aid the family directly. On their suggestion, Rose and LaToya built an altar in the basement which seemed to be the source of the activity. They took an end table and they covered it in a white sheet, and then placed a white candle and a statue of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus on it. They then placed a Bible on the makeshift altar, opened to Psalm 91. The group then took sage and sulfur and burned it throughout the home in a cleansing ritual, drawing crosses through the thick smoke as they read Psalm 91 aloud. The ritual seemed to work. For 3 days, the family had the first taste of peace since moving, but the demonic forces still present in the home had simply been rebuilding their strength. Offended at the attempt to force it out, the demonic attacks increased exponentially in severity. According to the family, demons directly began to attempt to possess LaToya and her 3 children. These effects even resulted in physical manifestations, with the children reacting when the demon was present by bulging their eyes, flashing evil smiles, and deepening their voices significantly. LaToya would describe feeling lightheaded, weak, and unnaturally warm when the demon would possess her. Her body would go into convulsions and she would struggle to regain control. Their youngest child, 7 years old at the time, would sit inside the closet and have long conversations with another little boy that only he could see. Once, he was hurled out of the bathroom by an invisible force as if he'd been picked up and thrown. Her other son, 10, would go into long descriptions of what it felt like to be murdered during his episodes of possession. However, the 12-year-old daughter seemed to be getting the worst of it. Once, a headboard seemed to move on its own and smack into her forehead, leaving behind a wound big enough to require a trip to the hospital. Later, as the authorities would become involved in investigating the case, she would tell mental health professionals that she would sometimes feel as if she were being choked by something invisible. Other times, she would be pinned down to the ground, unable to either speak or move. A strange voice would sometimes speak directly to her, though only she seemed to be able to hear it. The voice would tell her that she would never see her family again and that she would die in a matter of minutes. On April 19, 2012, 5 months after the activity had started, the family went to their physician, Dr. Jeffrey Onyukwu, to explain their situation. The doctor took notes as he listened to the family tell their story, writing in his notes that they were experiencing delusions of haunting phenomena, as well as hallucinations. However, skepticism would turn into belief in one shocking outburst that would be detailed by a Child Protective Services report of interviews with medical staff present. According to the official report, multiple medical staff witnessed as suddenly both boys began to curse Dr. Onyukwu in what they described as, quote, demonic voices. Then the youngest of the 2 boys was suddenly lifted up into the air and thrown into the rear wall. The staff all attested that nobody had touched the child or been near him when it happened. After this, both boys abruptly passed out, prompting a call to 911. Police and EMS personnel responded to the frantic call and quickly took the children to the local hospital. There, hospital staff laughed at LaToya's request to anoint her 2 sons in olive oil, though they could find nothing physically wrong with them. One of them eventually woke up, acting completely normal with no recollection of what just happened. However, the youngest child woke up screaming and thrashing, requiring no less than 5 adult men to hold him down. Child Protective Services began an investigation into the family, prompted by an anonymous call fearing the children were experiencing abuse or neglect. The caller believed the children were being coached by LaToya or performing for her, with her encouraging their eccentric behavior. DCS Family Case Manager Valerie Washington would handle the initial investigation and in an official report detailed the shocking events that turned her and others from skeptics to believers. According to Washington's report, the children were examined by hospital staff and discovered to be free of marks or other bruises, dispelling any notion of physical abuse. LaToya, meanwhile, was subjected to a psych evaluation and found by the hospital psychiatrist to be of sound mind. Washington then went to interview the family directly, detailing the horrifying events to follow in her official report. As Washington spoke with LaToya, the 7-year-old boy suddenly began to growl at her, baring his teeth like a dog. Unresponsive, the child's eyes then rolled back into his head as he continued to growl. Suddenly, the young child leaped forward and wrapped his hands around his older brother's throat, choking him. The adults present were forced to physically pry his hands off his brother's neck, and the child seemed to finally calm. Later that night, Washington and nurse Willie Lee Walker brought the boys into an examination room for an interview. The 7-year-old once more began to growl as he stared at his older brother, uttering in a deep, unnatural voice, "It's time to die. I will kill you." The older brother suddenly began to act erratically and started headbutting his grandmother in the stomach. Rose grabbed her grandson and began praying, but the prayers seemed only to encourage an even greater display of supernatural activity. What happened next would be corroborated by Walker and included in Washington's official DCS report. According to Washington and Walker's account, the older brother suddenly developed a weird grin, He then slid backward toward the nearby wall and began to walk backward up the wall to the ceiling. From the ceiling, the child somersaulted over his grandmother's head, never letting go of her hand. Washington and Walker had had enough. They fled the room in terror. The police would later interview Washington, asking her if perhaps the child had simply performed some sort of acrobatic feat, but Washington would dismiss the suggestion, stating the child had, quote, glided backwards on the floor, wall, and ceiling. Shortly after the hospital stay and the CPS investigation, the hospital chaplain, who had come to believe the family's claims, phoned Reverend Michael Maginot, asking him to perform an exorcism on one of the boys. Maginot was taken aback by the request and insisted on interviewing the family and investigating the home to rule out any natural explanations. On April 22, 2012, Maginot visited LaToya and Rose at her home, where he would experience multiple manifestations of paranormal phenomena. The first would be the flickering of a bathroom light within the line of sight of Maginot. Every time the Reverend got up to investigate, however, as soon as he approached the bathroom, the light would stop flickering. Then a set of Venetian blinds started swaying by themselves, despite there being no draft in the house. To Maginot's surprise, he also spotted wet footprints on the living room carpet. Maginot was a believer, and later would say that he believed the demonic forces were scared of him and what he represented. He blessed the house and sprinkled each room with holy water, warning the family to stay somewhere else as the home was not currently safe. The advice was likely prudent given the extreme backlash of the last attempt to purge the demonic forces. What happened next, though, would cause multiple police officers and a police captain of Gary, Indiana, to become believers. A little less than a week after the home was blessed, LaToya and Rose were forced to return to the house from where they'd been staying with relatives. Child Protective Services needed to check the condition of the home to rule out any possible suspicions of abuse, and thus a case manager, a Lake County police officer, and officers from Gary and Hammond would join the investigation. LaToya refused to step foot in the home, but Rose agreed to accompany the investigation. Investigators discovered that under the basement stairs was a dirt floor, despite the basement floor itself being made of concrete. Here, the concrete was jagged as if it had been broken on purpose. Rose would tell the officers and the CPS case manager that the evil activity seemed to emanate from this area. In the basement, they found the makeshift altar, along with rings of salt along the walls of the basement. LaToya had spread salt along the edges of the basement in an attempt to keep out the demons, though the effort clearly had not panned out. In an interview with a local newspaper, the Gary police captain on the investigation stated that he had believed in ghosts and the supernatural prior to this, but never demons. After visiting the home, however, he had completely changed his mind. As the officers interviewed Rose, one of their audio recorders began to malfunction. The power light flashed to indicate the batteries were dying, but the officer who had brought the recorder had just placed fresh batteries in it earlier that morning. The other officer also experienced an anomaly with his recorder. As he played the recorded interview back, he discovered a very clear and audible voice saying, "Hey," yet at the time nobody present heard such a voice. If you're a fan of our old Challenge series, you'll know that our very own Challenge guy recorded a very similar phenomenon at Waverly Hills, with a conversation taking place that nobody present heard at the time. The same officer who recorded the anomalous voice also took photos of the home for the case file. In a photo of the basement stairs, he captured a cloudy white image in the upper right-hand corner that purportedly showed a face. Numerous other phenomena were reported in photos taken of the home, and the Gary police captain reported his driver's seat moving on its own as he drove home that night. A mechanic later said that the motor in the seat was broken and that he was lucky it had not led to an accident. Clinical psychologist Stacy Wright remained skeptical of the entire case and stated that the youngest boy would act possessed whenever he was directly challenged or asked questions he didn't want to answer. Eventually, the boy began giving bizarre answers to questions, even when asked to retell prior events. He would also frequently change the subject mid-conversation, asking questions on math or things like outer space. Child Protective Services returned to the home to perform a more thorough investigation, this time joined by Rose, LaToya, the previous visit's police captain, and several more police officers. Maginot and a K-9 unit also joined, with the K-9 searching the home but displaying no particular interest anywhere in the house. Washington had refused to be further involved in the case, and she was replaced by Samantha Elich. Elich discovered a strange liquid dripping in the basement, noting it was slippery yet sticky when she pressed her fingers together. Later, the police officers discovered an oil-like substance dripping from Venetian blinds in one of the bedrooms. Despite their best attempts, though, they couldn't find a source of the leak. And determined to rule out the possibility of a hoax, they cleaned the blinds off with paper towels and sealed the room, standing nearby to prevent anyone from entering. A half hour later, when they re-entered the room, they discovered the oil had reappeared. Maginot explained that this was a physical manifestation of a demonic presence. Elich would report a strange feeling of pain in one of her pinky fingers, which quickly turned white. She was forced to leave the home, after which the pain began to subside. As night fell, the group left, most refusing to remain inside after dark. Weeks later, Maginot received permission to perform an exorcism on LaToya and the house. Several of the officers who had visited the home along with Elich attended the ritual, with all reporting a great unease during the 2-hour ceremony. Per Elich, she felt as if there was a presence in the room and could feel as if something was breathing down her neck. Soon after, Elich would suffer a string of misfortunes, including third-degree burns from a motorcycle accident, 3 broken ribs in a jet skiing accident, a broken hand, and a broken ankle. Maginot instructed LaToya to look up some information on the demons that might be haunting her. Using the internet, LaToya looked up the names of demons associated with the specific phenomenon that they were experiencing. According to her and a friend assisting her, throughout the search, her computer kept shutting down unexpectedly. LaToya, however, discovered the name Beelzebub, along with a few other minor and high-ranking demons that targeted children. Finally, armed with the names of the demons who might be harming her, LaToya received the exorcism she'd been hoping for. 2 police officers from the initial home investigation accompanied her to lend their support and restrain her should she become violent. Throughout the ritual, LaToya stated as if she felt as if something inside of her was trying to inflict as much pain as possible on her, while holding on to its grip on her simultaneously. The pain was as intense as childbirth, but she felt it was different than natural pain. Then, LaToya suddenly fell asleep. According to Maginot, this was a way for the demon to end the ritual early and lessen its effect. Maginot performed a second exorcism but then had to go on a personal retreat. When he was gone, the name of the demon believed to be infesting LaToya was written on a piece of paper and sealed inside an envelope without LaToya's knowledge. The envelope was then surrounded with blessed salt. When Maginot was away, LaToya contacted the church to complain of intense nightmares, and the sealed envelope was burned. Immediately after that, LaToya reported no more nightmares. The third exorcism, performed in Latin, would prove decisive, and LaToya and her mother Rose would no longer complain of any demonic activity. The family had moved out of the home and to a new one, where they reunited with their children after they were taken away into CPS custody for a brief time. Now go check out Special Forces Confession, I Recovered Crashed UFOs, or click this other video instead.